Thornycroft Huxtable, a dignified and pompous man, suddenly appeared at Baker Street, collapsing onto the floor due to exhaustion. Holmes and Watson tended to him, and he explained that he came from Mackleton in the north of England to enlist their help in finding the abducted son of the Duke of Holderness. The Duke was offering £5,000 to find his son and £1,000 to identify the kidnappers. Huxtable, the founder and principal of the Priory School, explained that 10-year-old Lord Saltire had been sent to his school 3 weeks prior. The boy was unhappy at home due to his parents' separation and was thriving at the school until he vanished on May 13th. His room was found empty, with his window open and no signs of forced entry or struggle. Huxtable suspected that German Master Heidegger, who was also missing, might be involved. Lord Saltire, a 10-year-old boy, has gone missing from Dr. Huxtable's school. His bicycle and that of the German master, who was not popular among the students and teachers, are also missing. The Duke, Lord Saltire's father, is frantic and has asked Dr. Huxtable to keep the matter quiet to avoid public scandal. Despite an initial investigation, no trace of the boy or the German master has been found. Sherlock Holmes is approached to take on the case. He listens intently to Dr. Huxtable's account and begins his investigation. He notes that the ivy and lawn where the boy disappeared would have yielded clues to an expert observer. Holmes suspects that the boy may have been prompted to leave by someone outside, possibly through letters. He discovers that Lord Saltire received a letter from his father, the Duke, on the day he disappeared. Holmes also meets the Duke and his private secretary, Mr. Wilder, who are both concerned about the case. In the English countryside, the Duke of Holderness Hall is worried about his son's mysterious disappearance. He asks Dr. Huxtable to consult Sherlock Holmes, who agrees to investigate. The Duke and his secretary, Mr. Wilder, meet with Holmes and Dr. Huxtable. The Duke explains that his son received a letter from him the day before he vanished, but there was nothing unusual in the letter. Holmes asks if the Duchess or a German master might be involved, but the Duke denies it. Holmes decides to stay in the area to investigate further. Holmes examines the boy's room and finds no clues except that he must have escaped through the window. He also investigates the German master's room, but finds nothing. Holmes then obtains a large map of the area and studies it, pointing out key features to Dr. Watson. He explains that the road past the school is the only way to travel by road, and that a country constable was on duty that night, making it unlikely that the boy and his companion used the road. Holmes also speaks with the people at a nearby inn, who claim that no one passed by that night. Holmes concludes that the fugitives must have traversed the country to the north or south of the house. He dismisses the idea of them using the southern route due to the stone walls and fields, but thinks the northern route, which includes a grove of trees and a large moor, is more likely. He believes their quest must lie in this direction. Dr. Huxtable arrived at the scene with a blue cricket cap, revealing a crucial clue in the mystery. The cap belonged to the missing boy and was found in the van of gypsies who camped on the moor. Holmes and Watson began their investigation, searching for tracks on the moor. They followed a watercourse, which led them to a morass between Holderness Hall and the school. After an initial disappointment, they discovered a bicycle track, but it wasn't the one they were looking for. The track was made by a rider heading away from the school, and they followed it backwards, eventually losing it in the boggy portion of the moor. The duo continued their search, finding another spot with the bicycle mark, and eventually they discovered the Palmer tire track, leading them to conclude that Herr Heidegger was indeed involved. As they followed the trail, they noticed the rider was forcing the pace and had a fall, leaving behind a bloody path. The investigation led them to a gruesome discovery: a bicycle smeared with blood and a shoe protruding from the gorse bushes, revealing the unfortunate rider's fate. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson investigated a case involving a missing boy. They found a dead German master who had been hit on the head near the school. Holmes deduced that the boy had left on his own, and the German master had followed him on his bicycle. The master was killed by a swift blow, suggesting the boy had a companion. They found no human footmarks or other bicycles nearby. Holmes and Watson followed the track of a bicycle with a patched Dunlop tire, which led them to a low, gray village. At an inn, they met Mr. Reuben Hayes, who was initially uncooperative, but eventually offered to help them get to Holderness Hall, where the missing boy's father lived. Holmes suspected that Hayes knew more than he was letting on. After eating, Holmes recovered from his sprained ankle and had an epiphany. He remembered the cow tracks they had seen throughout their journey and realized that they were important clues. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson investigated a mysterious case on the moor. They saw horse tracks but no cows, and Holmes noticed the tracks were sometimes close together and sometimes far apart. They visited a tumble-down stable and found two rough-haired horses with old shoes but new nails. The landlord, Reuben Hayes, was hostile and threatened them. Holmes and Watson left, but returned to observe the inn secretly. They saw James Wilder, the Duke's secretary, arrive on a bicycle looking agitated. Later, a trap with a single man drove away at a furious pace. Wilder was waiting for someone, and soon a second figure appeared. Holmes and Watson decided to investigate further. They discovered a patched Dunlop tire on Wilder's bicycle and saw him meet someone in a room at the inn. Holmes sent telegrams and consoled Dr. Huxtable, who was grieving the death of his master. The next day, Holmes and Watson visited Holderness Hall, where they met James Wilder, who was still shaken. Holmes insisted on seeing the Duke, despite Wilder's attempts to deter him. Duke Holderness, a nobleman, has hired Sherlock Holmes to find his missing son. Holmes meets with the Duke and his secretary, Mr. Wilder. Holmes asks the Duke about the reward offered for finding his son, which is £5,000 for information on his whereabouts and £1,000 for identifying those involved in his disappearance. The Duke confirms the reward and adds that it includes those who conspire to keep his son captive. Holmes reveals that he knows where the son is, and some of those involved, accusing the Duke himself of being one of them. The Duke is shocked and tries to negotiate with Holmes, offering him £12,000 to keep the incident quiet. However, Holmes refuses, citing the death of a schoolmaster that must be accounted for. The Duke confesses that his son, James, is not the murderer, but had employed the real killer, Reuben Hayes, who has since been arrested. The Duke explains that James is his illegitimate son, born out of a past love affair, and that he has kept him close due to his resemblance to his mother. Holmes agrees to help the Duke minimize the scandal, but only if he is completely frank about the situation. The story begins with the narrator fearing for Lord Saltire's Arthur's safety due to James Wilder's intentions. James, who has a taste for low company, became intimate with a rascal named Hayes, a tenant of the narrator's. James used Hayes' services to kidnap Arthur, luring him to a wood with a fake message from the Duchess. Arthur was taken to Hayes' public house, the Fighting Cock, where he was confined. The narrator explains that James's motive was to force him to break the entail, allowing James to inherit the estates. However, James's plan was foiled when Sherlock Holmes discovered a dead body, and James was overcome with grief and agitation. He confessed to the crime and begged the narrator to keep his secret for 3 days to allow Hayes to escape. The narrator reluctantly agreed, but eventually went to the Fighting Cock to rescue Arthur. Holmes intervenes, criticizing the narrator for condoning a felony and aiding a murderer's escape. Holmes demands that the narrator send a carriage to retrieve Arthur and warns him that James's continued presence in the household will lead to misfortune. In the end, James is banished to Australia, and the narrator makes amends with the Duchess. Holmes also discovers that Hayes learned to counterfeit horse tracks from James, who had seen ancient horseshoes with cloven feet in the Holderness Hall Museum. In the Middle Ages, the marauding barons of Holderness owned valuable items. Sherlock Holmes examined a shoe, running his moistened finger along it. A thin layer of recent mud remained on his skin. "Thank you," he said, replacing the glass. "This is the second most fascinating thing I've seen in the North." When asked about the first, Holmes showed a check he had received, carefully placing it in his notebook. "I'm a poor man," he said, patting the check and putting it in his inner pocket.